Thank you, Ollie. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Before I begin, I would like just to acknowledge the huge debt we owe for our present understanding of the Innsbruck School of Armor Making to a number of important armor scholars of the last 100 years. In my own study, the works on this subject by Oswald Graf Trapp, Sir James Mann, Claude Blair, Bruno Thomas and Ortwin Gamber, Mario Scalini, Alan Williams, Ian Eaves, and Tom Richardson have all been essential sources of both information and inspiration. And personally, I'm very grateful to the present Count and Countess Trapp for their encouragement, to Stefan Krause for his comments and assistance, and to Pierre Turjanian for his groundbreaking work on the Emperor Maximilian and his patronage of armorers, so lavishly presented in the exhibition The Last Night, held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2019. Anyone interested in the story of armor in Europe will quickly encounter places in northern Italy and southern Germany whose history is inextricably linked to the ancient art of armor. Armorers worked all over Europe, but the cities of Milan, Brescia, Augsburg, Landshut, and Nuremberg loom especially large in the literature, and rightly so. The production of plate armor required certain natural resources, iron ore, of course, but also timber, to fire forges and kilns and to make charcoal, essential for turning iron into carbon steel. The armorer's craft also benefited enormously from immediate proximity to fast-flowing rivers for transportation of raw materials and finished products, but also to drive the heavy water-powered machinery necessary for armor making on a large scale. Devices such as great trip hammers used to beat lumps of metal into flat plates, and glazing mills equipped with ranks of grinding and polishing wheels. The great medieval centers of production had ready access to all of these resources in abundance. This is just one of my favorite views of Landshut. It's a 17th century image, but it's useful for our purposes. It's right on the Isar, this very fast-flowing river, and you can see that just about everywhere that they can be placed, you have water wheels. Often, sometimes, double wheels set in different configurations, even on the little side flowing streams and things. The importance of water power can't really be overstated for an armor making city like Landshut. And those water powered wheels are powering equipment like this. Wheels that do both the heavy grinding, taking away the hammer marks and smoothing the surfaces of armor plates, and then also very fine grinding and cutting is done on different size wheels. Unlike Landshut, Augsburg, and Milan, Innsbruck seems not to have had a significant community of armorers before the second half of the 15th century. There are early mentions of armorers working for the Archdukes of Tyrol in nearby Halle, also an important center for the minting of coins, but it's not until the 1460s that Innsbruck started to become known for armor production. Interestingly, by the early 1460s, Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol was already presenting fine Innsbruck armors as very prestigious diplomatic gifts to his brother-in-law, King James II of Scotland in 1460, to Dieter von Eisenberg, Archbishop of Mainz in 1461. The Archbishop needed armor. He was fighting a war at the time. To his 6-year-old second cousin or nephew, Maximilian, more on Maximilian in a moment, and also to Maximilian's tutor, Wilhelm von Reichenau, Prince Bishop of Eichstätt, both in 1465, and to King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary and Croatia in 1468. One of the first names to be associated with the makers of fine armor in Innsbruck is Treitz. Konrad Treitz was working in Innsbruck by around 1452. And over the next 20 years, his family established themselves as one of the city's most important workshops. It has been suggested that the Treitzes may have been Italian immigrants from Trezzo to the immediate east of Milan. Now, the Duke of Milan kept a firm hold on the armorers in his dominion, and craftsmen could only emigrate if granted special permission. It is possible that the Tyrolean nobility, foremost members of the match and trap families, might have played a role in convincing the Duke to allow the Treitzes to settle in Innsbruck, thus laying the foundations for what would become one of the greatest centers of the armorer's art in the 16th century. Actually, the heart of the Innsbruck armor-making community was not initially in Innsbruck as such, but rather to the north and slightly to the east in Mullau. This is a 19th century map. You can see the River Inn flowing through. This is the center of Innsbruck here, and the Archduke's palace. And then Mullau, where most of the armorers settled initially, is up here in the top right corner. I think this is hugely interesting, again, from the point of view of water power, because if you look at the flow of the river, Mullau is right in that top bend, and rivers always flow fastest and strongest on the outer bend in any outer bend. So that is where the water power is strongest, and hey presto, that's where the armorers went. These were absolutely ideal circumstances for armorers to practice their craft. They had good working conditions, the right natural and technical resources, and most importantly, a local aristocracy keen to buy armor. It's very important to note that Innsbruck had been the capital of Tyrol since 1429. And I think it's no accident that almost all of the surviving armor made in Innsbruck before the 16th century is preserved at nearby Coburg Castle, the seat of the Match family since the 13th century, and which passed to their heirs, the Trapps, in the 16th century. Gaudenz von Match, an important nobleman and military commander who served both the Archduke of Tyrol and the Duke of Milan, was the Treitzes' most important patron. A number of pieces made for him by various members of the Treitz family are preserved at Coburg. Foremost, a simple but very elegant armor for war, the one on the right here. Here we see the Treitz workshop establishing a new armor style, fusing German technical construction with distinctly Italian aesthetics. This armor is almost devoid of raised fluting, and its smooth, pristine surfaces maintain a kind of harmony with the pure human form. Crucially, it was, of course, not just the design of the plates that determined the effectiveness of an armor. The quality of the metal was paramount, as was the armorer's ability to get the most out of his material. Steel, an alloy of iron and carbon, can be heat treated to improve its protective attributes, hardness and toughness. If good steel armor is well hardened and tempered by careful heating, quenching, and reheating, it can be made twice as protective as armor forged of wrought iron. Good steel armor, therefore, can provide better protection while also being lighter in weight. Innsbruck armors not only had access to the best steel, they also had special knowledge of the difficult and subtle processes of heat treatment. In only 20 or so years, Innsbruck had become famous throughout Europe as the source of the best plate armor. Writing probably in the 1480s and certainly before 1491, the renowned master of arms, Pietro Monti, tells us that if anyone wants to wear armor that is light and protective, he should use the very best iron and steel. The best iron and steel is found in the German city of Innsbruck. Masters there test armor with crossbows. Armor made in Innsbruck is outstandingly strong because of its temper. Duke Sigismund was the first inventor of this excellence. High-ranking noblemen like to take credit for things. By the late 1480s, more armorers from other great armor-making centers had relocated to Innsbruck to gain access to its resources and clientele, and hopefully to benefit from its increasing fame. The Augsburg armorer Hans Prunner is an especially interesting example. Prunner not only moved to Innsbruck, he also married a member of the Treitz family and adopted the distinctive Italo-German Treitz style. Several important surviving examples of Prunner's work are also preserved at Coburg, showing that he too was almost certainly working for Gaudenz von Match. An even more important commission came once again from Archduke Sigismund in 1488 for a fine war armor presented as a gift to the Archduke's 10-year-old third cousin, or great nephew, Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy, son of Maximilian. This remarkable little armor, delivered in 1489, is today preserved in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. It's now missing its helmet, but this armor nevertheless shows how completely Hans Prunner had absorbed and indeed advanced the Treitz style. Again, it's very plain. There's a bit of Germanic fluting on the legs, but the overall plainness is very distinctive of this style, as is the asymmetrical shoulder defenses, an Italian innovation adopted in Innsbruck. The various other key Innsbruck features like the gauntlets that are integrated into the lower cannons of the arm defenses. This is very much a development of the foundation established by the Treitzes in the last 10 or so years. Important though this commission was, it was the relationship with Prince Philip's father, Maximilian, that shaped the most illustrious chapter in the story of armor making in Innsbruck. Maximilian of the House of Habsburg is perhaps the most important figure in the history of the Northern Renaissance. Although he was the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, Friedrich III, and heir to the German throne, early in his life, Maximilian had no significant lands or titles of his own. Consequently, his father sought to expand German influence in Western Europe with a marriage between Maximilian and Mary, heiress of the powerful Duchy of Burgundy, diverse territories located in modern-day France, Belgium, and Holland. Mary's father, Duke Charles the Bold, had been killed fighting the Duke of Lorraine and his Swiss allies at the Battle of Nancy in January of 1477, a catastrophic defeat that exposed Burgundian lands to seizure by Louis XI, King of France. Maximilian moved very quickly. He married Mary of Burgundy in August 1477 to become Jura Uxorus, Duke of Burgundy. Now he was faced with defending his new duchy from its French and Swiss enemies. A foreign interloper who did not speak the local languages was not easily accepted, however, and Maximilian soon found that he had to win over the Burgundian and Flemish nobility not just through favors and diplomacy, but through personal feats of arms. To do this, he needed good armor, which would protect him in battle while also transforming him into the very image of a strong, heroic, and enlightened prince, God's rightful representative on earth. In his career as a patron of the armorer's art, Maximilian started off quite well. The armor he wore on his earliest campaign in Burgundy, shown on the right, was a virtuoso performance by the celebrated master Lorenz Helmschmied of Augsburg. This and subsequent armors made for Maximilian by Lorenz Helmschmied are utterly unique creations in the high Gothic style, at once advanced technology for combat and stunning works of body art. Armor at this level was not simply protective equipment for fighting, it was also an expressive sculptural and decorative art form that transformed the artist's patron into the living embodiment of power and righteousness, the personification of chivalry itself. Complete plate armor was what distinguished the aristocratic warrior or knight from all other fighting men. It was also a proclamation of wealth and status. Therefore, armor was a fundamental aspect of Maximilian's identity as a Renaissance ruler and a key element of the iconography of his power. Wearing such things into battle, Maximilian knew that he was not only very well protected, but also that people looked at him differently. By equipping himself in such harness, he was able to manipulate his public image. He could change the way his identity, status, and character were expressed visually to the world according to the needs of a particular situation. And I think it's actually quite revealing that he was soon commissioning armor from local Flemish craftsmen to create a warlike version of himself that was more familiar, more relatable to the Burgundian and Flemish aristocracy. Maximilian was crowned king of the German lands, or king of the Romans, as it was called, in 1486. And then in 1493, more importantly for today's discussion, he became Archduke of Austria when his elder second cousin Sigismund gave up the title. Innsbruck now became Maximilian's primary residence, which, as you can perhaps imagine, was an extraordinary development for the local armor-making community. Maximilian, by this time, had close relationships with armorers working in southern Germany, France, and Flanders, and yet his demand for the best armor was exceeding the production capabilities of the various independent workshops contracted to him. Maximilian continued to require diverse armors for his own personal use, but also, following the example of his predecessor, the Archduke Sigismund, he began to present armors as luxury gifts to members of his family and affinity, and to foreign rulers and diplomats. In these circumstances, it became more important than ever before that an armor from Maximilian was something very special. The emperor's own armors had not only to be highly advanced and innovative in their technical design and construction, they also had to be utterly original works of decorative and expressive art. Such unique creations could not be achieved purely by working with individual craftsmen, independent craftsmen. Maximilian needed arrangements that were more exclusive, more personal, more intimate. Maximilian's physical presence in Innsbruck attracted yet more armorers from other places, and the local armor-making community continued to grow. One of the craftsmen, who probably arrived sometime in the 1490s, was Konrad Seusenhofer. Seusenhofer, like Hans Prunner and a number of other immigrant armorers settling in Innsbruck, came from the great armor-making city of Augsburg. Unfortunately, we know nothing of his early life and his induction into the craft of the armorer, but that training probably occurred in Augsburg. He is first recorded in 1500, by which time he was already a skilled armorer working in Innsbruck. He had clearly distinguished himself in this vibrant community of armorers by the time Maximilian made the decision to establish a court workshop there. In 1504, Konrad Seusenhofer was employed for a period of 6 years to work exclusively for Maximilian as head of his new workshop. Now, Seusenhofer was responsible for making armors for Maximilian's own personal use and also for presentation to Maximilian's relatives, supporters, and peers. This was an enormous challenge, given that Seusenhofer only had 2 up. Nevertheless, he appears to have been hugely successful in this role. This image here by Hans Birkmeyer is undoubtedly the most important surviving picture of a Renaissance armorer's workshop. It shows Maximilian visiting Seusenhofer while he and his 2 assistants are hard at work. The craftsman on the right is busy hammering out fluting, and the one in the middle is making an articulation lame, while the master himself is making an armet, a type of enclosed helmet designed primarily for heavy cavalry use. In 1509, some considerable time before his 6-year contract was due to expire, Seusenhofer was made court armorer for life. This promotion also brought him more help in the workshop. His staff grew to 6 armorers, 4 polishers, and 2 apprentices, and their output increased dramatically. In just 4 of the following years, from 1511 to 1514, the Innsbruck court workshop produced over 1,000 complete armors and armor parts. The Wallace Collection includes several pieces made under Seusenhofer at the court workshop during this period. Some have been acknowledged and well known for a long time, while the most important example was only identified earlier this year. The more familiar pieces are a helmet and set of complete leg armor, all that remains of what was once a very fine armor for war. The helmet is an armet, a type developed in Italy towards the end of the 14th century, very similar, in fact, to the one we just saw Seusenhofer making in the Birkmeyer print. The armet is designed to fully enclose the head by means of hinged cheek pieces fastened at the chin, allowing the helmet to open up to accept the wearer and provided with a pivoted visor to protect the face. The leg armor is extremely fine, sculpted to follow the shape of the wearer's legs like a steel skin, and including integral sabatons to cover the feet. Interestingly, Seusenhofer was sometimes ordered to make armor in the Italian style, as stated specifically in surviving records. For example, in the order for a gift armor for the papal legate, Cardinal Raymond Perrault, in 1504. I can't help but wonder if these pieces in the Wallace collection are fragments of one such armor, not a truly Italian armor, but rather the German idea of one. If we compare the Wallace pieces to another armor made by Konrad Seusenhofer around the same time, you can see what I mean. This field armor, now in Vienna, was made in 1511 for Matthaus Lang von Wellenberg, a nobleman from Augsburg and one of Maximilian's most trusted advisors. This armor is an early example of a German Renaissance style that we still refer to today as the Maximilian style. This fashion is quintessentially German, with these groups of raised ridges or flutes embellishing most of the surfaces. This armor also has an armet, but it is of the classically German form, with a fluted skull and this very distinctive so-called bellows type visor. The Wallace Collection armet, which is a precise contemporary of the Wellenberg armor, is plainer, more Italianate, and the visor takes the angular sparrow's beak form typical of Italian armets since the early 15th century. The leg defenses represent an even stronger contrast, both in their technical construction and in their aesthetics. The whole sculptural character is different, as is the decoration. There is some fluting on the Wallace legs, but only on the side wings and the sabatons. To reiterate, we are not talking about the true Italian style of the early 16th century, but rather a German version of the Italian style, a fashion that, as we've seen, had been evolving in Innsbruck since at least the 1480s, if not earlier. We also see the visual contrast of these two styles in the pictorial art produced under Maximilian's patronage. As well as court armorers, Maximilian, of course, also had court artists, one of whom was the painter and printmaker Hans Birkmeier. Here are a magnificent pair of prints made by Birkmeier for Maximilian in 1518, a decade after he had become Holy Roman Emperor. The one on the right is an equestrian portrait of Maximilian himself, wearing a magnificent German armor and mounted on an armored horse. Its pendant on the left is almost a mirrored portrait of St. George, or perhaps it's another image of Maximilian in the guise of St. George. The contrast here, as in the comparison with the Wallace and Wellenberg armors, is very striking. The plain, smooth surfaces of the saint's Italian armor versus the profusely fluted, spikier armor of the emperor. The horse armor and other accoutrements are quite different too. It would seem, not at all surprisingly, that Konrad Seusenhofer was expertly literate in both styles. As well as being a remarkable demonstration of sculpture in metal, the Wallace fragments also carry very fine etched and gilt decoration in the form of elegant borders and strapwork bands. Etching was a revolutionary technique for decorating armor, and at this point, it had only appeared in the 1480s and coming into use more frequently towards the very end of the 15th century. Thus, etching had only been known for around a generation when it was employed on this armor and on the Wellenberg armor. Here, the metal was first coated in an acid-resistant material like wax or pitch called the resist. The etcher then scratched his design out of the resist with a needle-like graving tool, exposing only those areas to the biting of the corrosive etchant, a chemical paste, the active ingredient of which was usually mercuric chloride, or sublimate, as it was called historically. The central motif on the decoration of the Wallace pieces is the pomegranate, one of Maximilian's personal devices. The pomegranate was a well-known symbol of the Passion of Christ, the husk, splitting open to reveal the ruby red seeds inside, being evocative of the wound in Jesus's side. We might hope that such a personal emblem might perhaps tell us something about the identity of the original owner of this armor. Unfortunately, I don't think it can narrow the options down very much. This could conceivably have been made for Maximilian himself, but on the other hand, we can imagine that it might have been quite important for devices associated with Maximilian to be present on just about any armor given as an imperial gift. A number of other fragments survive, which are closely comparable to the Wallace parts. Most of them are incorporated into a composite armor originally assembled in the later in the 16th century to represent Maximilian in the Hall of Heroes, installed at Ambras Castle at Innsbruck by Maximilian's great-grandson, Ferdinand, Archduke of the Tyrol. This set was constructed using parts from at least 3 different armors of Maximilian and at least 2 different horse armors. The helmet, shoulder defenses, and body armor for the horse were made by Lorenz Helmschmied. The cuirass is a Flemish one worn by Maximilian in the wars in Burgundy, and the chafron, arm and leg defenses, and the gauntlets were all made in the Imperial workshop under Konrad Seusenhofer. On the cuff of one of the gauntlets is a date, 1511, and it seems reasonable to take this date as a good indicator of when the Wallace fragments were made. There is also another gauntlet, once in the collection of Sir Walter Scott, and which remains at Scott's house at Abbotsford in Scotland to this day. This gauntlet might even belong to the same armor as the Wallace Collection parts. So 1511 was a busy year for Konrad Seusenhofer, during which he and his staff made many fine armors for some of the most important noblemen of the age. These included armor for Friedrich the Wise, Prince Elector of Saxony, and Charles de Croy, Prince of Chimay, one of Maximilian's most important allies in Burgundy, and godfather and tutor of the emperor's grandson, the future Emperor Charles V. There was also the Wellenberg armor already mentioned, and several others decorated in silver and gold for King Henry VIII of England and other prominent English noblemen, and other armors for Heinrich IV, Duke of Brunswick, Jakob Fuchs von Fuchsberg, another important Tyrolean aristocrat, Erhard von Polheim, a member of an upper Austrian noble family with close personal ties to Maximilian, Aloisio Gonzaga, Marquis of Castel Goffredo, a young Italian condottiero in the service of the empire, and an unfortunately unidentified Duke of Scotland. Another very important development in the history of armor occurred in 1511. In that year, an Innsbruck armorer named Hans Rabeiler started building an armor for the emperor's grandson, the 10-year-old Archduke Charles, future Emperor Charles V. This armor was utterly original in design, sculpted to create in steel the appearance of the most fashionable dress of the moment. The so-called puffed and slashed style seems to have originated in the flamboyantly distressed clothing of the famous German mercenaries known as Landsknechte. Here, the outer facing material of the doublet and hose was cut with slashes to reveal an interlining of a contrasting color. Color combinations and slashing patterns varied endlessly. The style had burly, muscular military associations at the same time as projecting fantastic luxury. The style rapidly caught on in aristocratic courtly circles. And since armor is clothing, it was only a matter of time, very little time in fact, before armors in the puffed and slashed style appeared. And they surfaced first in Innsbruck in the form of this little armor. Note how the puffing and slashing is arranged in horizontal bands, with those on the legs seeming to droop under the influence of gravity. This armor was unfortunately never finished. It's possible that the young Archduke outgrew the armor before it could be completed. He may have been growing faster than the armorer could work, or it may have taken too long to begin the project in the first place. It's also possible that the armorer was not being paid on time, and so he stopped working on the project, giving the boy time to outgrow it before it could be worn. The next attempt at this new ostentatious style was also made for Charles, probably as a second run at the same gift idea. And this one was completed in 1514. This masterwork of Renaissance armor making was not made by Hans Rabeiller, but in the Imperial court workshop under Konrad Seusenhofer, and is preserved today in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. This is the earliest complete armor to follow contemporary military and court fashion. Not only does the form of the steel plates evoke the billowing volume of textile dress, it actually incorporates real textile in its construction. Very rich purple silk velvet has been laid into these vertical recessed bands and then overlaid with these fabulous pierced copper gilt panels. Interestingly, after the plates had been finished and etched, Seusenhofer sent the new complete armor to Augsburg, where this goldsmith's work was added. Notably, between 1512 and 1514, when this second boy's armor was on his workbench, Konrad Seusenhofer and his staff also made a near identical one for the impressive 6'2" frame of King Henry VIII of England. This adult version of the design was delivered to King Henry in 1514 by Hans Seusenhofer, Konrad's brother, who had moved to Innsbruck from Strasbourg to work in the Imperial workshop. It's likely that Hans worked on Henry's armor, and he probably needed to be present at the delivery to carry out a final fitting with the king personally in England. Sadly, the only fragment of this historic gift from the Emperor Maximilian to his young ally, King Henry, is this helmet, now in the royal armories. The mask is a portrait of the 55-year-old emperor himself, and on the skull, we can see the recessed panels that would have held the velvet and copper gilt strapwork, now long lost. This daring idea of rendering the fashionable base or pleated skirt in steel seems to have become a signature of the Imperial workshop. Here's another one made under Konrad Seusenhofer between about 1512 and 1515. This one is somewhat less ornate than that of the boy's armor, but it is still very fine. You can see the diagonal slashes placed over etched and gilt bands, simulating strips of cloth of gold. Note also the embossed ribs between the slashed panels. Those will become more important in a moment. Again, Henry VIII's gift armor had a steel base, like the one on the boy's armor, and it seems to have made a big impression on him. Inspired by Maximilian's example, and perhaps frustrated by the fact that he could not respond to the gift with one in return, Henry set about founding his own court workshop, which ultimately would be based at the Royal Palace at Greenwich. This armor was made just a year or so after the receipt of the gift armor. This is the first creation of Henry's own court workshop, staffed by Flemish and German craftsmen. This is a fascinating armor, I think, because it embodies the process of Henry's quest to create his own unique court style. Here he's combining elements of different contemporary styles in an effort to produce something uniquely Henrician. The majority of the armor conforms to the Italo-Flemish style, which dominated in England at that time, but to it, inspired by the work of the Innsbruck masters, Henry has added one of these distinctive steel bases. Although we are now looking at the work of craftsmen in England, this is nevertheless a fascinating demonstration of the far-reaching influence of the innovative creations of the Imperial workshop at Innsbruck. The year 1515 also brings us to the other newly identified work by Konrad Seusenhofer in the Wallace Collection. This impressive foot combat armor has been somewhat misunderstood for a long time. It was once identified as simply German, circa 1540. In the early 20th century, the attribution was revised to Augsburg, circa 1525, with the etching attributed to the great Augsburg etcher and printmaker, Daniel Hopfer. The Hopfer attribution was based on the identification of the decoration on another armor, then at the Historical Museum in Berlin, as his work. The etching on this armor, made for Friedrich II, Duke of Landsknecht, in many places is closely similar to that found on the Wallace Collection armor. The case for this Hopfer attribution was thorough, detailed, well observed, and completely wrong. And it established a misconception that endured for a century. Daniel Hopfer is well known to have worked closely with the Helmschmieds, and he did certainly etch many of the greatest masterpieces made under Lorenz Helmschmied's son, Kollmann, in the 1520s. Therefore, the attribution of the etching on the Wallace Collection armor to Hopfer via the misidentified Landsknecht armor then led to the tentative identification of Kollmann as the armorer responsible for the hammerwork of the Wallace Collection armor. The idea that the Wallace Collection armor was made in Augsburg then remained firmly in place for a very long time and gradually caused it to increasingly be thought of as slightly inferior work. If you move forward with the idea that it was made in the 1520s in Augsburg, perhaps by an assistant or follower of Kollmann Helmschmied, the Wallace Collection armor starts to look perhaps a little less glamorous. But this is because the path of investigation quickly leads one to compare it with armors in the Landsknecht style that really were made in the 1520s by Kollmann Helmschmied. And here they are. On the left, the remains of a Landsknecht garniture made in 1523 by Kollmann for Wilhelm von Rogendorf, a military commander in the service of Charles V. And on the right, these parts from a slightly later armor in the same style, but with even more lavish decoration, probably made for Jerzy Hercules Radziwill, a powerful Polish nobleman in about 1525. The Rogendorf armor in particular is one of the most famous of all Renaissance armors and was already a celebrated attraction of the Imperial Armory in Vienna by the early 19th century. The opulence of these amazing billowing sleeves, rendered in steel in a totally original way by Kollmann Helmschmied, lends these armors a unique drama. A direct comparison of, say, the Rogendorf armor and the Wallace armor is a little unfair especially when one is suffering under the misapprehension that the two armors were made around the same time in the same place. Maybe in this light, the Wallace armor looks more, perhaps, conventional. But this is the wrong way to look at this armor. My recent research has shown that, in fact, this armor was made not in Augsburg circa 1525, but rather in about 1515 at the Imperial Court workshop under Konrad Seusenhofer. This makes it, along with the two boys' armors of Charles V, one of the earliest examples of the Landsknecht fashion rendered in steel, made nearly a decade before the Helmschmied examples, a style created in Innsbruck and only later adopted by craftsmen in Augsburg. Just look at it, alongside its closest relatives. This is one of many examples in the history of art of when you know where and how to look, the truth starts to become clear. The tight horizontal slashed bands, flanked by raised ribs, are already present on the unfinished boy's armor. They appear in a slightly varied form on the second one, the skirted armor of Charles V, and again on the Wallace armor. Also, look at the treatment of the slashes with these very fine engraved borders. These are everywhere on the products of the Seusenhofer workshop between 1510 and 1515. Here they are on the boy's armor, on a pauldron from an otherwise lost field armor in Vienna, and on this fabulous Seusenhofer jousting helmet, now in Moscow. Incidentally, there are also elaborations of this engrailing wherein each cusped point or every other one becomes a little club or trefoil through the addition of a trio of etched dots. Such variations of the engrailed border are found on the boy's armor, on parts of another contemporary Innsbruck Landsknecht garniture now in the Royal Armories in Leeds, and on the Duke of Legnica's armor, now in Moscow. Remember, the misidentification of the etching on this armor is what led to the mistaken attribution of the Wallace Collection armor. It turns out that the Moscow armor is yet another creation of the Seusenhofer workshop, also made around 1515, and also carrying many of the other classic Seusenhofer signature features, which we can now recognize. Not just the engrailed borders, but also the alternating sunken banding on the breast and back plates, the small recessed slashes, the converging flutes on the elbows, which recall the composite Maximilian armor from Ambras, and of course, the fabulous steel base. There's one other thing about the etching on the Wallace Collection armor that I must mention. As we've seen, this armor, along with the two boys' armors of the future Charles V, represents one of the earliest expressions of the idea of representing rippling cloth in hardened steel. This armor is sculpted to look like puffed and slashed textile, and fire gilded to suggest a cloth of gold interlining showing through the multitude of slashes. So far, in that, it follows the example of the second boy's armor. But the Wallace Collection armor adds something new to the idea as well. All of the smooth areas between the slashed bands have been etched to simulate the pattern of rich, voided silk velvet. This decoration has also been executed in what was then an innovative new method of etching. Let's call it raised etching. Here, rather than scratching out the design from the resist, the design is being painted on with the resist. This produces a quite different visual effect, since it is the background being bitten down into the metal while the design remains proud. Now, with most German raised etching, the background is filled with tiny granulations created by painstakingly applying minute dots of resist with a small brush, or perhaps even a pig's bristle. But here, uniquely, we don't have these granulations. We find these little U-shaped forms instead. These tiny details represent a weaving technique called allucciolato in Italian, which refers to stars shining in the night sky. If we look closely at a piece of real Italian silk velvet of the period, we find these little loops of gold wire that have been pulled up through the velvet pile. They add a unique sparkle to what is already very rich textile. Isn't that wonderful? On the Wallace Armour, a revolutionary new etching technique has been used in a cunning way to suggest playfully that what we are looking at is in fact not steel, but luxurious velvet. Konrad Seusenhofer died in 1517, and Maximilian followed him to the afterlife less than 2 years later. Their unique relationship, an artist and his patron, endures in a way on Maximilian's cenotaph in Innsbruck. Here, this extraordinary monument is surmounted by a life-size sculpture of the emperor kneeling in prayer. Of all the armors he might have worn in this image, the one he has chosen is a Seusenhofer armor. Maximilian founded the Imperial court workshop as one of many ways to project his power and express his identity. And now his armor plays that role for eternity. If you'd like to read more about my work on the Landsknecht armor in the Wallace Collection, do have a look at the recent volume, Arms and Armor, History, Conservation, and Analysis, Essays in Honor of David Edge. With the correct identification of this important armor, the Wallace Collection has gained a masterpiece by Konrad Seusenhofer, one of the greatest ever practitioners of the art of armor. I feel a little as though we have actually acquired a new work of art. And that, for a curator of a closed collection, is very exciting indeed. Thank you.